3 years after a car accident left Vivienne Blackwood in a wheelchair, the CEO of Blackwood Crown Holdings trusted no one, not her family, not her board, not the guards posted outside her locked office door. When a threat appeared inside a room only 3 people could access, she was forced to hire Nolan Reed, a quiet single father who had once protected heads of state. Nolan did not bow to her power, and he did not look at her with pity. But the closer he came to the truth, the more he realized the person trying to erase Vivienne had been standing beside her all along. If you believe loyalty can outlast betrayal, stay until you discover the secret Nolan uncovers before it is too late. The 63rd floor of Blackwood Crown Tower sat above the Chicago skyline like a sealed vault, all glass and steel, and the particular silence that comes when powerful people are arguing too carefully to raise their voices. Vivienne Blackwood positioned herself at the head of the conference table with the kind of controlled stillness that people in boardrooms often mistake for weakness and later regret. Her uncle Gideon, silver-haired and practiced in the art of looking reasonable while advancing unreasonable things, was urging the board to approve the partial sale of Blackwood Crown to Vale Meridian Capital, a firm whose offer had arrived with curiously favorable terms and a valuation that Vivienne had already flagged as 30% below what any honest calculation would produce. She laid her counter-analysis on the table, without ceremony, walking through the numbers with the fluency of someone who had been reading financial statements since she was 12 years old and had been told to earn her place in a company that already bore her name. Gideon let the silence breathe for a moment before suggesting, in the gentlest voice he possessed, that perhaps the pressures of her recovery were affecting her judgment. Vivienne did not blink, did not shift in her chair, and simply continued explaining the discrepancy in the projections until every person in the room understood that she was not a woman whose judgment required anyone else's permission to exist. When the meeting ended and the last board member filed out with averted eyes, the 63rd floor belonged entirely to Vivienne and the faint hum of the city 40 stories below. She returned to her private office, entered the 4-digit access code that only 3 people in the world possessed, and found something on her desk that had not been there 2 hours earlier. It was a black chess queen, hand-carved ebony, one of 32 pieces from a board that had sat in the library of the Blackwood family estate since before Vivienne was born, and one of its tiny wheels had been snapped cleanly off, leaving a small scar in the wood. Beside it lay a strip of paper with 9 words printed in plain block letters. "The next vote will be your last." Vivienne studied the note for a long time before calling her head of security, Declan Rowe, a man who had served the Blackwood family for 22 years and who arrived within 4 minutes, looking appropriately alarmed. The corridor cameras had recorded nothing. The elevator log showed no unauthorized entries, and Declan concluded with well-practiced certainty that the object was likely a psychological provocation rather than a credible physical threat. Vivienne did not argue with his conclusion, but she recognized the chess piece. She had played with that set as a child under her uncle's instruction, and she knew it had never left the estate's locked library without her approval. Something had shifted in the architecture of danger around her life, and she understood with the cold clarity that had kept Blackwood Crown solvent through 3 recessions that the person behind this threat was not a stranger reaching in from the outside. A security firm's recommendations arrived in her secure inbox later that evening, and buried in the attachments was the profile of a man named Nolan Reed. 49 months of verified close protection work across 4 continents, 3 declined contracts with billionaires who had refused to give him unrestricted authority to assess risk, and a current status listed simply as available. Nolan Reed arrived at the Blackwood estate the following Tuesday morning, in a charcoal suit that fit him well without announcing itself, carrying no entourage and displaying no visible reaction to the kind of architectural wealth that typically made people either reverent or self-conscious. He was 39 years old, and looked like someone who had spent a decade learning to be the least interesting person in any room he entered. Not because he lacked presence, but because presence, in his profession, was a liability. Vivienne conducted the interview from across a desk, wide enough to serve as a comfortable buffer, and she opened by asking whether he believed he was capable of protecting a principal who used a wheelchair. Nolan paused for exactly 1 second before answering that the wheelchair was not the variable he would be analyzing, and that the real vulnerability in any protection arrangement was a security system designed by people who had convinced themselves they were infallible. He then spent the next 10 minutes identifying specific failures in the estate's current setup without being invited to do so. A decorative sculpture on the second-floor landing that blocked the field of view for 2 cameras, a private elevator with no independent backup power, an emergency exit corridor that was 17 inches too narrow to navigate comfortably at speed, a scheduling system in which Declan Rowe's office received Vivienne's full itinerary 18 hours before she did, and a set of access codes that rotated on a monthly schedule controlled entirely by the security director himself. Vivienne did not write any of it down because she had already memorized it by the time he reached the 3rd item. When a household assistant moved toward Vivienne's wheelchair to reposition it during a pause in the conversation, Nolan spoke without raising his voice and asked the man to wait until Ms. Blackwood indicated she wanted assistance. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone has said something that everyone else was supposed to already know. Vivienne noticed, and she filed the observation next to everything else Nolan had demonstrated in the past 12 minutes. Not compassion performed for her benefit, not the practiced deference of someone trying to impress her, but the simple operational logic of a man who understood that a person's body and the things attached to it were that person's domain. Nolan then listed his conditions: unrestricted authority to restructure her daily schedule, full background access to every member of the current security team, and immediate access to the investigative records from the car accident 3 years prior. Vivienne had not survived the past 3 years by handing open-ended authority to anyone who asked for it, and Nolan had not built his reputation by serving as a decorative presence beside people who had already decided they knew everything. They negotiated for 40 minutes and eventually agreed on a 30-day contract timed precisely to the date of the merger vote. Before he left, Nolan crouched briefly to examine the floor near Vivienne's desk. Not the surface she could see, but the floor beneath it, and when he stood, his expression had shifted by approximately 2 degrees in a direction she would later recognize as concern. There was a fresh gouge in the hardwood, barely a centimeter long, indicating the desk had been moved and returned in the middle of the night. Nolan spent his first 72 hours on the assignment mapping every route Vivienne used habitually, every transition point where her path narrowed, and every interval in her schedule where she moved without a direct line of sight to the building's interior cameras. He did not reorganize her life according to his preferences. Instead, he built a set of layered alternatives so that she always had 2 or 3 options and could select among them independently. This approach was quietly radical in an environment where Declan Rowe had spent years citing security concerns as a reason to limit Vivienne's public appearances, restrict her movements, and ensure that the shape of her day remained predictable to the people around her. On the fourth day, Nolan discovered that her full itinerary was being routed to an external server that did not appear in Blackwood Crown's official network architecture. The data was passing through a high-clearance security account, which meant the transmission had been authorized at a level that prevented routine system alerts from flagging it. He documented the anomaly and shared it with Vivienne without conclusions, letting the data speak and giving her the space to direct what came next. 2 days later, during a routine transfer through the building's underground parking structure, the overhead lighting failed across an entire section of the garage at 11:14 in the morning, and a cargo van with its parking brake disengaged began rolling slowly and with apparent purpose toward the space where Vivienne's vehicle was positioned. Nolan did not shout or sprint or perform the kind of visible heroics that get retold at security industry conferences. He engaged the locking mechanism on Vivienne's wheelchair with one practiced motion, moved her into the shadow of a concrete support pillar, and deployed a folding wheel chock he carried in his jacket pocket to arrest the van's movement before it reached them. It was over in 11 seconds, and neither of them was injured, but the message embedded in the incident was unmistakable. Someone had known exactly where Vivienne would be, and exactly when the lighting would fail. When Nolan later conducted his standard post-incident sweep of the wheelchair's frame, he found a GPS tracking device no larger than a coat button adhered with precision to the interior of the undercarriage, in a location that required familiarity with the chair's specific geometry and access during a period when Vivienne was not seated in it. The only window that matched both conditions was her twice-weekly physical therapy sessions in Blackwood Crown's private medical suite. Vivienne was quiet for a long time when he showed her what he had found. Not the frightened quiet of someone overwhelmed, but the colder quiet of someone recalibrating every assumption they have held about the people around them. She told him to find whoever had put it there, in the particular tone people use when they have already made their decision and are simply giving it a voice. The device's product registration traced to a procurement order processed through Blackwood Crown's internal security purchasing system, and the name of the approving officer on the digital paperwork was Declan Rowe. Declan denied any knowledge of the purchase, delivering his denial with the smooth, unruffled energy of someone who had spent 2 decades being believed. He suggested his electronic credentials had been compromised without his awareness, and Gideon, who appeared at the meeting uninvited, reinforced this position by reminding everyone that Declan had protected the Blackwood family through the kind of difficult years that created loyalty one simply did not question. Vivienne had not yet granted Nolan her full trust, and that gap in their working arrangement had consequences. She was still withholding specific details about the day of the accident 3 years earlier, including information about changes to her schedule in the hours before the crash, and without that context, Nolan could not complete the chain of events he was reconstructing. The tension surfaced openly one afternoon, when Nolan rerouted the elevator she normally used to a different car without consulting her first, explaining afterward that the regular elevator's maintenance log contained an anomaly he had not yet resolved. Vivienne told him, with a precision that required no volume to be forceful, that she was not interested in trading one set of constraints for another, and that the specific texture of her situation was that she had already spent 3 years being managed by people who believed their idea of her safety was more important than her own judgment. Nolan acknowledged this directly instead of deflecting it, and said that he could not protect someone who was concealing half the relevant information, not because he needed control, but because the architecture of a threat cannot be mapped from incomplete data. They were still arguing when the elevator stopped between the 31st and 32nd floors. The internal communication panel produced a burst of static, and a voice began speaking from the overhead speaker. Distorted, deliberately processed, but unmistakably addressing Vivienne by a name she had not heard in 3 years. Vivi B, the nickname used exclusively by members of her immediate family in the years before the accident. Nolan activated the emergency power circuit he had installed in the elevator's secondary panel 2 days earlier, bypassed the locked control interface, and brought the car down to the technical floor, where it could be opened manually. In the aftermath, sitting in a utility corridor that smelled of cable insulation and old concrete, Vivienne finally told him what she had been keeping. She said that in the weeks before the accident, she had been tracing a large sum of money, not the kind of figure that disappears by accident, that had been quietly transferred out of the family's private endowment fund and into a holding structure she did not recognize. She also said that on the morning of the crash, her regular driver had been replaced at the last minute, without explanation, by a man she had never seen before, who had presented valid credentials and whose employment history, she later discovered, could not be verified past 18 months. Nolan sat with this for a moment and told her that what she had described did not read like an assassination attempt. It read like a disablement strategy, designed not to kill her but to remove her from a position of operational power. In the data logs he pulled from the elevator maintenance system that evening, he found a segment of embedded code whose structural signature was nearly identical to the software later identified in the vehicle's corrupted brake control module. Nolan requested access to the Blackwood family estate's library so that he could examine the chess set from which the broken queen had been taken. Vivienne agreed with a reluctance that had nothing to do with Nolan and everything to do with the fact that she had not returned to that house since the paramedics had transported her from the scene of the accident 3 years earlier. The library was exactly as she remembered it. Dark wood shelves, high windows facing the garden, the chess set on its dedicated table near the fireplace, and for a few minutes she did not speak at all, and Nolan did not ask her to. She had grown up in this room being taught that the queen was the board's most powerful piece and simultaneously its most targeted one, a lesson her Uncle Gideon had delivered with the particular warmth of a man who believed he was preparing her for the world while quietly deciding how much of it she would be permitted to access. Nolan said nothing about this. He moved to the chess table, assessed its height and the table's clearance from the floor without remark, repositioned a side chair so the space was accessible from her approach angle, and returned to his examination of the display case where the chess set's storage box sat open and clearly short one piece. The adjustment was small and completely practical and cost him approximately 4 seconds, and Vivienne noticed it the way you notice a thing that should have been ordinary and somehow never was. A call came through on Nolan's phone, and he answered it quietly, stepping 3 feet away, close enough that Vivienne could hear his tone shift without catching the words. His voice, which she had only known in its professional register of low and measured, became something else for the 2 minutes he spoke to his daughter Piper, who was 11 and apparently having a disagreement with her school's scheduling system. He did not become a different person, but the seams of the professional surface became briefly visible, and what was underneath was not softness exactly, but a kind of uncomplicated warmth that had the effect of making Vivienne want to look away. When he returned to the investigation, she said nothing about the call, and neither did he, and they both understood that the moment had passed but had not disappeared. The storage box showed a void where the missing queen had rested, and the surrounding velvet lining had been disturbed in a way that suggested the piece had been lifted by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The security camera covering the estate's library entry had been powered down for 4 hours on the night in question, and when Nolan pulled the access log for the disabling command, it traced to an administrative code that belonged to either Vivienne Blackwood or Declan Rowe. Declan produced documentation placing him in New York that evening, a hotel check-in, a dinner receipt, a building access log, and Gideon's presence at a charity gala the same night was confirmed by a guest list of 240 people and a 12-second appearance in a news photograph. When Nolan returned to the tower, Vivienne received a message containing surveillance footage that appeared to show him entering a restricted records archive at 2 in the morning, and the door log confirmed that his access card had been used to open it. Nolan accepted the suspension without resistance, surrendering his equipment methodically and asking only one thing before Vivienne's security team escorted him out: that she review the timestamp data on the footage herself rather than delegating the review to someone else. He explained, calmly, without the urgency of a man trying to talk his way out of something, that the footage contained micro-repetitions in the background motion pattern, a signature consistent with composite video, in which a face has been digitally layered onto pre-existing material, rather than recorded in real time. Vivienne had been betrayed by people with convincing explanations before, and she knew exactly how sincerity could be manufactured by someone with sufficient skill and sufficient motive. She told him to leave and spent the next 3 hours alone, reviewing the timestamp data herself. She found the anomaly he had described. That same evening, while Nolan was no longer on the premises and her security team had reverted to its prior configuration under Declan's indirect direction, a sealed envelope appeared on the pillow in her private bedroom at the estate, a room accessible only through 2 locked doors and a biometric panel. Inside was a photograph of her sleeping in that same room, taken at close range, and a line of text that read, "You just dismissed the only person keeping you alive." The logic of the message was straightforward. Whoever had placed it had known the exact moment Nolan was removed from her protection, which meant they were either monitoring his status in real time or receiving information from inside her security apparatus, neither of which was consistent with his being the threat. Vivienne called him at 6:17 the following morning. She did not spend significant time on the apology because she was a person who understood that extensive apologies were sometimes a way of making the apologizer feel better rather than actually repairing damage, and she did not believe in theatrical contrition. She said she had been wrong and that she wanted him to come back, and when he arrived, he did not require her to demonstrate remorse at any particular length. He set one condition before they resumed: that neither of them withheld information relevant to the investigation going forward, regardless of how uncomfortable it was to share. Together with Tessa Monroe, a forensic auditor Vivienne had retained months earlier under a confidentiality arrangement so tight that even her assistant did not know Tessa's real function, reconstructed the financial pathway behind the tracking device. Tessa had located a payment chain running through 3 shell companies, each registered in a different jurisdiction, with the final entity in the chain carrying a registered address that placed it in a subsidiary network connected to Vale Meridian Capital. The more significant discovery was that the account used to initialize the first shell company had been opened with a forged identity, not Declan's name, not Gideon's, but Nolan Reed's, using a fabricated employment history and a set of identification documents that had been prepared before Nolan was ever contacted about the Blackwood assignment. Someone had built him into the architecture of the conspiracy as its eventual scapegoat weeks before Vivienne selected him from the referral file. A cross-reference of old service invoices produced the name Royce Bennett, an independent automotive technician who had performed a pre-trip inspection on Vivienne's vehicle the morning of the accident. Royce had not testified in the original investigation because no one in the inquiry had known to look for him, and in the years since he had left Chicago entirely, settling in a small town in Wisconsin under circumstances that suggested deliberate quietude rather than ordinary relocation. He agreed to meet with Nolan and Vivienne on the condition that no member of Blackwood Crown's internal security team accompany them, and that the meeting take place entirely outside the company's communication systems. Royce was in his early 60s now, with the careful posture of a man who had spent 3 years being very precise about what he remembered and what he was willing to say aloud. He told them that on the morning of the accident, he had received an emergency repair authorization for Vivienne's vehicle, not an unusual occurrence in a fleet of that size and usage, but that the specifications on the authorization had required modifications to the braking assist system that were outside the parameters of normal scheduled maintenance. The authorization had been submitted under Declan Rowe's name, and the verbal confirmation attached to the record carried an audio stamp of 2 initials, GB, spoken in a voice that had been processed just enough to obscure whether it belonged to Vivienne Blackwood or to someone performing a reasonable imitation. Royce had recognized the discrepancy between the work order's technical specifications and standard safety parameters, and had kept a duplicate of the record because he understood that paperwork with those kinds of margins did not typically survive in its original form once an incident occurred. After the accident, Declan had come to see him privately, not to threaten exactly, but to deliver a payment and a clear understanding that the transaction covered his continued silence. Nolan arranged for Royce to deliver the documents directly to a federal investigator he trusted, bypassing Vivienne's possession of the original materials so that she would not become the chain of custody and therefore the primary target. The route back to the city had been compromised. Someone had mapped their movement, and rather than return to the tower or the estate, Nolan took Vivienne to a safe house in the city's northwestern neighborhoods that he maintained entirely outside his professional network and which appeared in no file connected to Blackwood Crown. It was a small apartment above a dry cleaning business, furnished without ambition, and for the first time in 3 years Vivienne was in a room that contained no board, no staff, no glass walls, and no one performing their role. She said that the thing she feared most was not death, but continued dependence on people who might be manufacturing the conditions of her helplessness while presenting themselves as her protection. Nolan told her about the period after his wife's illness progressed past the point of recovery, the particular education of being simultaneously the person who provided care and the person who was running out of the ability to do so, and said that what he had learned was that needing help and being diminished by it were two separate things that he had spent too long treating as identical. This conversation was interrupted by an alert on Nolan's secondary device. An internal Blackwood Crown account had queried the home address of his sister, where Piper was currently staying. The query had returned the correct address. Piper was not yet in danger, but the message behind the search was entirely legible. Nolan began preparing to transfer the assignment and remove himself from Vivienne's protection. Because a threat directed at Piper was a lever he was not willing to give anyone the opportunity to use. Vivienne told him that she would not allow the people behind this to determine who stood beside her and when, and that she had access to a residential property that did not appear in any Blackwood Crown documentation. A house registered under a legal structure her mother had established before Vivienne was born, for reasons that had never been fully explained but which now served an entirely practical purpose. She arranged for Nolan's sister and Piper to relocate there quietly, with protection that did not surface in any system Declan or Gideon could access. She did this without making it a demonstration of generosity or a negotiating move. She did it because it was the correct thing to do, and she had the means to accomplish it. Nolan understood what it had cost her to extend that kind of unilateral trust, and he stayed. When they returned to the Blackwood Crown systems together and ran a refined search of personnel access records, they found that the internal query about Piper's location had originated from a workstation registered to Margot Ellis, who had served as Vivienne's chief of staff for 9 years, and who Vivienne had considered, until that moment, one of the few remaining people inside the organization who had never given her cause for doubt. Vivienne confronted Margot in a small conference room, and Margot did not attempt a denial. She produced instead a phone she had been carrying in a locked pouch for 4 months and explained, with the measured composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her own mind many times, that she had been feeding information to a federal investigator, building a case against Vale Meridian's acquisition strategy and the board members facilitating it. She had maintained complete secrecy because she had suspected the company's security apparatus was being used against Vivienne rather than for her, and she had not trusted any internal channel to carry that suspicion safely. From the locked pouch, she also produced an encrypted drive containing transaction records showing funds from Blackwood Crown accounts, moving through Vale Meridian intermediaries, and returning as payments to a set of numbered accounts that Declan's name was not attached to directly, but which became traceable to him through 3 levels of nested documentation. Gideon's name was similarly absent from the surface of any individual transaction, but every completed transfer produced a financial benefit that would accrue exclusively to Gideon's personal holdings once the merger was finalized and the board's composition changed. Tessa, reviewing the same drive independently, found a calendar modification buried in the board's scheduling system. The merger vote had been quietly moved 7 days earlier, which meant that instead of having the week they had planned for, Vivienne had 72 hours. The vote was now scheduled for the evening of Blackwood Crown's annual shareholder gala, in front of every major investor, in front of the press, and in a venue controlled entirely by Declan Rowe's security infrastructure. Declan appeared at the tower's executive level the morning of the gala with a security review document citing irregularities in Nolan's background verification and formally requesting his removal from the building. He delivered this in front of 6 senior executives, and his confidence carried the particular quality of someone who had never before experienced a Blackwood woman publicly refuting him. Vivienne reviewed the document for exactly 15 seconds before informing the assembled room that Nolan Reed's authority within Blackwood Crown was established by her, remained current, and was not subject to review by anyone whose clearance derived from hers. The room processed this in silence while Declan adjusted his understanding of the position he was in. Nolan and Tessa had spent the previous 2 days constructing what Tessa called a canary trap, 3 versions of the evening's security and movement plan, each containing a single unique detail invisible to the other versions, distributed separately to 3 different internal recipients. A private security team that Declan had arranged without authorization showed up exactly on the route specified only in the version he had received. The digital transmission log from his personal device confirmed the leak at 11:40 that same morning. Declan disappeared before they could formally detain him, but his access credentials continued showing activity inside the tower's systems, which indicated that someone at a level above him was maintaining his permissions in the network after his physical departure, a detail that clarified with cold efficiency that he was operating as an instrument rather than an architect. Before the gala began, Nolan walked Vivienne through the building's revised emergency routing. Not as a briefing she was expected to absorb and comply with, but as a demonstration that the path existed and functioned and could be navigated by her independently. He had spent 2 days redesigning it so that every transit point was fully accessible, so that no corridor required assistance, and so that the system worked for the person using it rather than around her. Vivienne told him she trusted him not because he had promised her safety, but because he had never once pretended that everything was under control when it was not, and she said this simply, without theater. Nolan told her he had developed feelings for her that exceeded the professional relationship, and that he had no intention of allowing those feelings to become a question she needed to ask about his motives, which was why he was telling her now, and why he intended to do nothing about them until after the contract ended, and there was no longer any structural reason for her to wonder. She accepted this with a seriousness that matched his own. An alert from the building's maintenance interface then confirmed what Nolan had suspected since examining the elevator's secondary systems. Declan had installed remote override access into the fire alarm network, the elevator controls, and the magnetic locking system for the gala floor's security doors, and all 3 systems would respond to commands issued from a device that was no longer inside the building. Vivienne arrived at the gala through the main entrance, under the lights, in front of every camera and every guest, because using the service entrance was a concession she had decided not to make. Nolan walked beside her, not half a step behind, not positioned between her and the room, but beside her, in the way that 2 people walk when neither is escorting the other. Gideon opened the formal proceedings with remarks about Blackwood Crown's future, delivered with the warmth of a man who believed he was performing a kindness, weaving through his language references to the company's need for fresh leadership and the particular challenges facing an executive who carried personal circumstances that might affect her long-term capacity. Vivienne was preparing her response when the fire alarm engaged at 8:57 in the evening. Not a local sensor trigger, but a system-wide activation routed through the remote access channel Declan had embedded. The elevator banks locked immediately. The fireproof partitions descended across the gala floor's main corridor, and the emergency announcement system directed all guests to use the stairwells, which Vivienne could not use, and which everyone in the room understood she could not use. Gideon moved toward the cluster of board members and suggested, with the practiced smoothness of someone executing a plan he had rehearsed, that the vote could be conducted in the secondary conference room on the floor above, accessible by stairs, and that the logistics of the emergency made it necessary to proceed without waiting for everyone to reconvene. Vivienne had already moved. The technical corridor that Nolan had reconfigured ran parallel to the gala floor's exterior wall, and she navigated it without assistance, arriving at the secondary conference room's service entrance before Gideon's group had settled into their chairs. The board members stared at her with an expression that took a moment to resolve itself from surprise into something more complicated. Declan materialized from the corridor behind the group, gave a direct order to the security personnel flanking the room's entrance to remove Nolan from the building, and when the two officers exchanged a glance that suggested they were not certain the order was legitimate, Declan reached beneath his jacket. Nolan read the motion before it completed, covered the distance between them in 4 steps, and contained the situation without injuring Declan in any way that would prevent him from standing before a court in full health. Vivienne reached the room's internal security panel and engaged the magnetic lock on the service exit before Declan could move toward it. On the gala floor below, Tessa had routed the financial documentation to every screen in the building simultaneously. The ledgers, the shell company registrations, the transfer records, the authorization trails. Everything visible at once to the shareholders who were still in the room, to the journalists who had come to cover an anniversary celebration, and to the federal agents who had been waiting in unmarked vehicles on the street outside the tower for approximately 40 minutes. Gideon stood in front of the board he had cultivated and told them that Declan had acted independently, that the financial irregularities were the product of one rogue employee's ambition, and that he himself had been deceived along with everyone else. He delivered this with the conviction of a man who has told the same story enough times to believe its architecture is sound. Nolan activated a recording that had been captured 4 days earlier, during the window when the canary trap was still running, and Declan had made contact with his sponsor to confirm that the alternative route had been used and that the information pipeline remained intact. In that recording, Gideon's voice was clear and unprocessed, confirming that his instruction 3 years prior had been to create an incident serious enough to frighten Vivienne into withdrawing from the financial investigation she had opened. Not to injure her permanently, not to kill her driver, but that Declan had recalibrated the scope of the sabotage to ensure she would not return to an operational role, and that both of them had subsequently arranged the cover-up that buried the technician's original work order. Gideon said, in the recording, that he had done what he did to protect the Blackwood legacy from a woman too stubborn to recognize that her particular style of leadership would eventually destroy what their family had built. Vivienne, seated in the center of the room with every eye on her, asked him quietly whether a legacy that required betrayal and violence to survive was still something that deserved the name. The federal agents came in from the stairwells. Gideon and Declan were taken into custody with a minimum of noise and a maximum of documentation. 3 board members with documented connections to the shell company network were suspended pending investigation. Vale Meridian's acquisition proposal was formally withdrawn before midnight. When the last government vehicle had gone and the gala floor had emptied to a handful of staff collecting glasses and folding equipment, Vivienne sat alone near the windows with the lights of Chicago laid out below her in the same configuration they had occupied every night of her professional life. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. The truth had not returned the 3 years she had spent moving through a world shaped by what someone had done to her body and her authority, and it had not erased the specific pain of knowing the person who built that world was someone who had taught her to play chess and called her the most powerful piece on the board. Nolan came and sat nearby. Not beside her yet, simply nearby. And he did not say that it was over, or that she could rest now, or any of the other things people say when they want to close a chapter that is not theirs to close. He asked if she wanted him to walk beside her or stay where he was. She said beside, and he moved. 6 months passed, and Vivienne remained the chief executive of Blackwood Crown Holdings, not as a symbolic retention, not as the resolution of a legal battle, but because she was the most qualified person available, and the restructured board understood this without needing it explained. She rebuilt the company's governance from the financial layer outward, making the accounting systems auditable by independent third parties in real time, replacing the access control infrastructure with one that had been designed without any single administrator holding override authority, and committing a portion of the company's annual capital allocation to accessibility standards for employees and properties across every division. These changes were not made because she wanted Blackwood Crown to become a story about her, or because she believed her experience gave her a particular authority to perform virtue. They were made because she had spent 3 years inside a company that had been designed around the convenience of people who had never needed to consider whether its systems worked for everyone. She still used her wheelchair. She still attended physical therapy twice a week because maintaining her physical health was practical, and because she had decided long ago that her body deserved investment regardless of what it could or could not produce. The story did not offer her a recovery as reward for surviving. What she had recovered was not mobility but latitude, the space to build her own life according to her own specifications. Nolan established his own security consulting firm in the months after the contract ended, specializing in protection frameworks that were designed around the autonomy of the principal rather than the comfort of the protector. Blackwood Crown was his firm's first client, contracted for ongoing security architecture review, on terms that placed him in an advisory relationship rather than a reporting one. He and Vivienne had waited until the original contract had been formally closed and the new professional structure had been established before either of them acknowledged that the conversation they had agreed to postpone was now eligible to happen. They did not announce anything publicly or make a production of the beginning. They simply began meeting for dinner on Thursday evenings, and then other evenings, and the city outside the restaurant windows carried on without requiring commentary. Piper came to the opening of a new skills training center Blackwood Crown had funded in the city's south side, a facility that offered certification programs in technical trades and was designed to the same accessibility standard Vivienne had applied across the company's other properties. The 11-year-old walked up to Vivienne with the unself-conscious directness that children deploy when they have not yet learned to perform formality, asked how long it took to build a building that big, and accepted the answer without the reverence that adults tended to bring to conversations with Vivienne. Nolan watched this from across the room and understood, without requiring it to be articulated, that the two most significant parts of his life were capable of existing in the same space. In the final weeks of the year, Vivienne and Nolan walked together through the corridor of glass on the gala floor, the same corridor that had been sealed and weaponized against her 11 months before, now simply a passage between two rooms. Nolan moved with the slight forward attention of someone who has spent years navigating spaces on behalf of other people, and his hand drifted by habit toward the handle of her chair before he caught himself and returned it to his side. Vivienne watched him do this and found that it did not irritate her. It was simply a man unlearning a reflex and replacing it with something more honest. She told him that he did not need to protect her from the world and everything in it, that the world was largely something she had been managing on her own before he arrived and would continue to manage after any given day. Nolan said he knew this, and that what he wanted was simply to be present on the days when she decided to face it, not to go first, not to go after, but alongside. She reached out and took his hand, not because she needed steadying, but because she had chosen to, which was the only reason she had ever needed. He walked beside her through the corridor, without leading and without following, and for the first time since the night 3 years ago, when an ambulance had carried her away from a car that someone had redesigned to be her last. For the first time in all of that long distance, Vivienne Blackwood was not handing control of her story to anyone. She was simply choosing who walked with her while she told it herself.